All right, everybody. Welcome to Hacking Health, a podcast where spirituality and science merge to better the lives of our listeners. I'm your host, Waylon Gomez, and today we're going to be talking about the neuroscience behind meditation. Yes, neuroscience. Now, I know what you're thinking. Is this going to be boring? Is this going to be a massive overload of information? Is this going to be like something that I just can't apply in any way, shape, form? Well, the answer to all of those is no, and here's why. Neuroscience, I actually ended up getting interested in neuroscience probably a few years ago. And the reason I got so interested in it was A, I'm a huge freaking nerd. Now, that's not the point that I want to make though. B, the reason I got interested in neuroscience is because it helped me to better understand how to take some of these concepts that were very difficult to grasp and put it into a way that was easily understandable by the behaviors and the science behind how the brain works. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk to you a little bit just about how meditation affects our brain and some of the different aspects. Now, this is a study that's happening, and it's a very, very big study. So it's something that's still an ongoing process. And I think that as we come to the next few years, maybe even the next 10 to 20 years, I think this research is going to become much and much more profound. But for the time being, I want you to take everything I say today with a grain of salt because while a lot of this is stuff that has been out for a while and has been well established, again, some of this stuff is still just theoretical. So don't go necessarily saying, oh, Waylon said this thing and now it's totally true. That's not true. I'm not condoning that. But what I am condoning is curiosity, because I think that through that ability to be more curious about how these things work, we're able to get to a place where we can better understand and better apply these concepts. So let's dive in. So guys, there are so many benefits neuroscientifically from meditation that it would make your head spin if we went through all of them, and we'd be here for a week. We're not going to go into all of them, but I am going to go into a few that I think is going to apply to the people who are listening today. So the first one that I want to talk about is how meditation actually prevents aging. Now, no, meditation is not the fountain of youth, although in this study, they were actually comparing it to an analysis basically trying to understand the fountain of youth principles behind meditation. And here's why. So this was a study that was done at Yale. And what they found was that as people aged, there was a degradation or a loss of gray matter across the whole brain. Now, what you have to understand about gray matter is basically just the concentration of cell bodies within the brain. And essentially what that means is that as we start to age, we start to lose our cognitive function because we don't have as much density in our gray matter. Now, what this study found was that in individuals who were long-term meditators, there was less of a degradation. Now, what this means is that in those individuals, they had better cognitive function just from meditation, and they took a pretty large sample size. I want to say it was either 50 or 70 different people that were all in the same age. There was a control group that did not do any meditation, and then there was another group that had been long-term meditators. So we're talking people who have done it for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. That's what we mean by long-term, not I went to, a weekend getaway and meditated for 6 hours a day for 3 days. These are people who have a continual practice. But what they found was that there was a positive correlation between meditation and better gray matter. In terms of just as we age, normally what happens is that the gray matter starts to decrease. It's a natural phenomena. As we get old, things start to break down. We know that's true. It's just part of the process, people. However, in people who meditated, what they found was that that breakdown was significantly less. Now, when they took the younger meditators and compared them to the old meditators, they found that there was still a degradation, but it was significantly less than in the control group. So what that means is that just simply by meditating, there's this thing that happens that we're still trying to figure out exactly why it is, where we have better gray matter density. Now, we're going to go into another study that was done that goes a little bit more in depth of how that can affect us. So what we have to understand about that gray matter is that gray matter has been linked to a lot of different things, specifically within the hippocampus. Now, again, I know that's a big scientific word, but what I want you to think about is it's the memory and emotional regulation part of our brain. So one of the things that they started to find in this study, they were studying for Alzheimer's. Now, Alzheimer's is a disease that a lot of people are suffering from nowadays, and it's something that's becoming more and more prevalent. And what they found within this study was that when they took individuals who had Alzheimer's and they ended up putting them on a 4-week meditation program, if you will, just a mindfulness meditation, nothing crazy, but they were doing a small amount of mindfulness meditation every day for 4 weeks. And what they found was a lot of their Alzheimer's symptomology ended up dropping quite significantly. It doesn't mean that they were necessarily reversing their Alzheimer's, but what it does mean is that a lot of the symptomology of them forgetting things and other symptoms that come with Alzheimer's was decreased. Now, the reason why this is important and what they found through the study was that when people were meditating, their hippocampus actually had more gray matter density. Now, in the past study that I told you about Yale, we understand that the idea of that gray matter density has to do with aging, right? Basically, as we start to lose gray matter across the whole brain, we start to have less good cognitive function. Now, what that means is that in this particular study, they linked that when it came to Alzheimer's to the hippocampus. Now, here's what's interesting. One of the things that the hippocampus does is emotional regulation, right? What are we talking about when we say emotional regulation? It's how you're regulating your different emotional states, right? So it's the idea of how long after you get angry can you come to a state of calm? Is it something that eats away at you for hours and hours and hours, or is it something that you can get a little bit angry, you can express it, and then you can move on from it? That's what we're talking about with emotional regulation. And that emotional regulation is connected also to the memory center because of the hippocampus. So think about that link as well, that connection between my emotions and my memory associations. And then it starts to beg a bigger question. Is there any connection? Again, just a thought on my end. Is there any connection between our ability to have healthy emotional processing of our memories and those memories themselves? And again, we understand the whole idea. If you don't move it, you lose it, right? But when it comes to Alzheimer's, is there a possibility or a potentiality, again, just a curiosity of mine, that it may have to do with those individuals' inability to regulate their emotional states by accepting their memories and things that happened in the past instead of running away from them? So the reason why I say all of that is because there's another correlation here that's really, really important. When it comes to the idea of that gray matter density in the hippocampus, what they found was that positive thoughts were what actually increased that gray matter density. Now that makes sense, right? When you get into states of meditation, true meditation, you get into states of peace and contemplation, and positivity is normally something that results from that. So if positivity results from that, then the whole idea is that just by thinking positive thoughts, you can start to reinforce that gray matter density in your hippocampus, which means that just by thinking positive thoughts, you can have better emotional regulation, better memory retention, and at the same time decrease the likelihood of Alzheimer's, potentially. Again, just a study. So the reason why this is important is because what they found was that there was a feedback loop that was happening here. And basically what that meant was the more positive thoughts that you were able to think and hold on to, the more that gray matter would increase in its density in the hippocampus. The more that gray matter increased in its density, the more easily you'd be able to think those positive thoughts. Now, this is really interesting when we start to think about this because there are many, many different links when it comes to, again, the age-related perspective. Think about as people get older, how set in their ways they are. Because you have to realize that the idea of gray matter density also helps with neuroplasticity, meaning that the more gray matter density we have in the brain across the whole brain, the easier it is for us to create new and different neuronal connection pathways. Basically, we become less rigid in our thinking. Now, how many old people, just think about in your life, how many old people are not very rigid in their thinking? Probably not very many. There's probably a lot more people who are very rigid in their thinking than there are that aren't rigid in their thinking. And part of the reason why may actually be because of what's going on in the brain as we age with this decrease of that gray matter. However, that also leads the question, if that's connected to what's happening in that hippocampus, is it possible that as we start to have that decline happen naturally, it gets harder for us to look at the positive? And then the whole idea of being old and curmudgeonly, maybe it's something that's a neurological deficit, not just because they're old, but maybe it's because of what's happening with their brain. And if it's what's happening with their brain, then how do we reverse that? Well, meditation is one of the ways that we can start to reverse those principles. We can start to get back more of that gray matter. But what's interesting is that, again, just like the study said, they're finding that even in people who are long-term meditators, it's different between people who are young compared to people who are old. So then the question is, how long do you want to wait before you start picking up something that's going to help you with cognitive function down the line? If you wait until you're 60 to do this, you may be already working at a decent deficit. But if you start when you're in your early 20s, where are you going to be when it comes to the idea of getting to your 60s or 70s? What we're talking here is not about the idea of turning back the clock. What we're talking about is preserving the clock itself, right? We can't necessarily reverse aging, but what we can do is we can prevent the aging from happening as fast with what these studies are showing. So I want to leave you off with one other thought on this before we continue on to our next piece of the puzzle, which is going to be with the default mode network. When it comes to the whole idea of this hippocampal growth, right, and this decrease in gray matter density versus increase in gray matter density, one of the things that we actually find that's really interesting is when it comes to SSRIs, right? Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors? Serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors. It's one of those two. Anyway, what we find with SSRIs is one of the side effects is that SSRIs actually, as a side effect, increase gray matter volume in the hippocampus, which again, we look at the whole idea of SSRIs and their effect on positivity, and it starts to bring into question, is part of what's happening with those SSRIs, not just the serotonin piece, but the side effect of increasing the volume in the hippocampus, which we know leads to the idea of more positive thinking and positive thinking being easier, potentially partially because we have better emotional regulation. We know that if we have a decrease in that volume, emotional regulation goes down. So again, when we're looking at this whole idea, what we've come to understand now is that not only can meditation help prevent that speeding up of the aging process and cognitive decline, but it can also get us out of rigid thinking patterns. And beyond that, it can help us with our emotional regulation, which again, how many people who are listening to this right now wouldn't benefit from a little bit of help on the emotional regulation side? I know I personally would. So now, what I want you to think about next has to do with the default mode network. And this is where we're going to spend most of our time is on the default mode network because it's really, really important. And the science is still coming out on a lot of this. So take everything, like I said, with a grain of salt. These are just theories, and some of it has been fairly proven. But again, the scientific model is never necessarily around the idea of wanting to say we had this one study and this is the truth. It's almost always trying to disprove itself to have the most efficacy. So that being said, I want you to think about the idea of what the default mode network is to start. And I'll give you a little bit of an example. How many of you, just in your own mind, think about it. How often do you get caught up in overthinking, in ruminating, or even perhaps in the idea of just self-reflective or introspective kind of thought, right? How often do you find yourself daydreaming throughout the day? Well, all of this is connected to the default mode network. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of history on the default mode network because it's important to understand really how groundbreaking this was of an understanding and also how recent this is. Which you have to realize the recentness of this means that there's still a whole lot more to study when it comes to understanding the default mode network. So it was discovered in 2001 by a guy named Marcus, and I'm going to try not to butcher his last name, but I really tried to find the pronunciation and could not. So we're going to say Rachel, maybe it's Reichel. If anybody knows, please let me know down in the comments. That way I can pronounce it appropriately. So he's an MD, and it was interesting because what he was curious about, what he was trying to figure out, is that the brain had been already proven to not have that much less activity in a resting state than in a state where it was active. And this really confused people because when they were doing a lot of the research and study, they were kind of picking it up just as noise on the resting state, but they didn't really understand why there was so much activity when we were resting. I mean, there was very little difference between the two. And so what he started to realize is that the amount of oxygen that the brain takes up, we know that in terms of the oxygen that we bring into our body, I think if I remember correctly, it's about 20% of that is used by the brain. So again, it's a significant amount of our oxygen is being used by the brain. And even when we're in a resting state, it was the same. So he ended up doing research that basically discovered the default mode network. And essentially what the research was finding was that there was hardly less energy when the brain was at rest than when it was active, but also that this different area of the brain ended up being activated. I'm going to go back and say that again. So what Dr. Rieschel discovered was basically the idea that when the brain was at rest, there was still this activity going on, but the activity was in a specific place. Now I'm going to throw out a couple of different names of where this connects to, and I promise I'll make a little bit more sense of it in a second. So when it came to this whole idea of the different areas of the brain, some of the areas that were connected were the medial temporal lobe, the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the ventral precuneus, and the parietal cortex. Now, basically, what this broke down to was there was memory involved, there was language and hearing involved, there was planning and higher cognition involved, there was consciousness, and there was language comprehension, among other things. But it was interesting because what they found was that even in this resting state, these parts of the brain lit up. And what was fascinating was that as he continued these studies year after year, he started to find that when we had focused attention, this area called the default mode network would start to shut down. The activity in it would start to go dark. Now, here's the reason why this happens. So the default mode network, what we came to understand about it is that it helps with the idea of cognitive processing in the background. Basically, when we look at the idea of imagination and daydreaming, visualization, even the idea of introspection, all of these things happen in the default mode network. They take our attention away from a focused cognitive task. But if we have to do a focused cognitive task, that area starts to shut down so that we can bring all of our focus and attention to what it is that we're trying to do. So what he started to understand about the default mode network is that it was an entirely different part of the brain that hadn't really been explored in that way. And it was groundbreaking research. And for quite a while, it was something that it was just kind of a theory. Now it's for the most part been proven, though there are still some people who are on the fence about it, but there's been a lot of research about the default mode network, and they're starting to look at the connections between it and things like addiction or mental health disorders. So when we look at this whole idea of the default mode network, we're talking about the idea of introspection and referential thought. So that means that when you are, let's say, for instance, sitting, listening to this podcast, are you actually listening to my words, or is it something where your mind is going off on tangents somewhere else? If your mind is going off on tangents somewhere else, then what's happening is that default mode network is actually activating more than your focused attention centers of your brain. Now, here's why this is important. So when we look at this idea of these two different types of attention, we have our default attention, which comes from the default mode network, and we have our focused attention, which is where we're consciously focused on something. And they play two very different roles. Now, the default attention helps with the idea of creating words and images. It works on the idea of past and future. It helps with memory recollection and the idea of, again, that introspection. So what would be the purpose of that? Well, here's what's interesting. When you think about the idea of creative thought is going to come more from the default mode network than our focused attention. And here's why. That allows us to be able to go into a more rested state where we can start to process some of these different things that are happening. So now this is just my own personal take from the research that I've done, but my curiosity is, does this default mode network actually connect to part of what we're talking about when it comes to the subconscious mind? Now, some of the areas, again, the medial prefrontal cortex shouldn't necessarily be connected to the subconscious mind, but when you start diving into it more, you start to realize that a lot of the things that we're talking about, guys, when it comes to this area of the brain are very deeply connected to the way that we talk subjectively about the subconscious mind. So again, some of those different things is daydreaming, imagination, right? Visualization is a big part of that, the self-referential nature. And then beyond that, the interesting part is that when the default mode network becomes overactive, meaning that it's got way too much activity, it starts to create lapses in focus or attention. And so that's where someone's droning on about something, right? And you go off on your own little tangent in your own little world. And then out of nowhere, you're snapped back and you're like, oh crap, I wasn't paying attention. That's the shift between your default mode network and your focused attention in an imbalanced or an asynchronous way. And we'll go into that in a minute for why it's important to learn how to sync those up, because it's a big connection to not only meditation, but productivity. So you want to become more productive in life, learn how to get into what's called a flow state, which we'll talk about, and learn how to connect your default attention compared to your focused attention. So let's talk about focused attention. Now, focused attention is a little bit different because there's not all of this rumination, self-referential thought. There's not all these words and images. It's literally, I am here, I am present in this moment, and this is the only thing. It's what we would call a state of presence. So what's interesting is that when we look at the idea of mindfulness meditation and things of that nature, we say, okay, so that's what I'm going for, right? In truth, mindfulness is about coming to the present moment. But remember, the default mode network doesn't work in the present moment. It works in the past and the future. So if it doesn't work in the present moment, then our focused attention, which is our conscious awareness, is what works in the present moment. So this is where it starts to become really interesting because we recognize that both of these serve a different function, right? Default mode network is going to serve the function of being able to have that introspection, creating that sense of self, creating that understanding of how I create a representation or how I affect or am affected by my external environment. But it's a very internal disposition. Consequently, the focused attention is the opposite, right? I'm not really having all of these thoughts about what I should be doing or where I should be or this thing or that thing. I'm just focused on what's happening in front of me. And I am so presently aware. I am so in that moment that I'm completely absorbed in it. And that's the only thing that's there. So here's where it gets really interesting because when we look at this idea, let's take it into comparison for our meditation, for instance, right? So let's use the example of I get up early in the morning and I go to meditate, which funny enough is one of the worst times to meditate based off of this neuroscience because it's the highest activity of your default mode network. So we'll dive into that in a little bit, but just keep a little kernel of that stowed somewhere and we'll come back to it because it's important to understand that when you're meditating, you need to pick the time that's going to be best for what you're really trying to do. And the morning usually is not the best time to create focused attention because your default mode network is what's normally kicked up the most. So, and the morning is usually not the best time to sit down and meditate if you don't understand how to create focused attention first, because the default mode network is going to take over. And before you know it, you're going to get into daydream la la land. And then you're going to come back and get upset that you couldn't stay focused enough to be in meditation. So again, I digress. When we look at this whole idea of what this means for meditation, I want you to start to think about the idea of how many times you've tried to meditate and it just hasn't worked, right? You've sat down and out of nowhere, the thoughts start running and you're like, did I do this? Maybe I should have done that. What about this? Oh, I'm not focused. It's not working. Well, yeah, of course you're not focused because you're not using focused attention. But instead, I want you to think about a moment where you ended up, let's say you had some work or you were with friends and you were so presently aware, you were so focused that it was almost like time stopped in a way. You weren't really aware of time. You weren't tracking time. And before you knew it, 2 or 3 hours had passed and you were like, oh my gosh, it only feels like 5 or 10 minutes. It's because your attention was so focused that you didn't have a sense of self in that moment in the way that we normally do. What you had instead was you had this hyper-focused attention where the default mode network all but shut off and just kept going in the background. But there weren't all of those normal thoughts that you would have coming up. So this is the power that focused attention can have. Now, when you're in meditation and you're struggling, part of the reason why is because you're experiencing effort. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about effort when it comes to neuroscience. So one of the ways that it's been defined is effort is the desynchronization between your default attention and your focused attention. So what does that actually mean? Well, think about it. Let's take the example of you're going to go out to the grocery store. So you're going to go out to the grocery store and you decide that you're not going to prepare a list because you don't think you really need it. You got it all in your head, right? And it's going to be fine. And you get into the store and then out of nowhere, you're bombarded by the realization that you are not prepared in the way that you need to be to actually get the food that you need to get. Because it turns out that there's a huge boom of people and you forgot, oh, there's a football game. So now everybody's here and everybody and their mother's here and it's really, really difficult and you're trying to get through it. And what happens? Well, your focused attention starts to wane. And as your focused attention starts to wane, that default mode network starts overactivating more and more and more. And you start to get into all the thoughts. Was I supposed to get this? Was I supposed to get that? Well, maybe I was supposed to do that. No, that doesn't make any sense. Ooh, look, that's on sale. Oh, wait, I don't need that. Okay, wait, stay focused. Okay, go to the meat section. Oh man, there's so many options. Which one should I get? Should I get this one? Should I get that one? And before you know it, right, you are totally sapped. And so you're just going flying by the seat of your pants, making whatever unconscious decision just to get out of there. Now, here's what's happening behind the scenes. Here's what's happening in your brain. Basically, you set out to do a task, but you didn't realize that your default mode network, that default attention needs to know how to complete that task. If it doesn't know how to complete that task, then what happens is that it starts to run in all these different directions, trying to find what's going to complete that task. And it starts to create a disorganization in your focused attention that doesn't allow you to actually take the action you need to. This is where the link between this and procrastination is. So as we start to understand this better, what we start to understand about it is that if I don't have a set way of getting my default attention in sync with my focused attention using something like a list, or we'll go into in a second some of the better options than just a list because it gets more complex but also more simple than that. If I don't have the ability to get my default attention reined in to where it needs to be, then it's not going to be able to feed those messages to my focused attention part of my brain so that I can take action on things appropriately. And before you know it, I'm going to get hit with distraction. So if our default attention really needs that list, really needs that ability to see, hey, where's the finish line and how do I get there? If I don't give it that, then it's naturally going to create distraction because as it starts to increase its activity, what happens is that our focused attention starts to wane. And before that, it's really hard for anything to keep our attention for a very long period of time. Now, here's what's interesting when we go a little bit deeper into this. If we look at the idea of something like ADHD, which we'll go into a little bit further in a minute here, but if we look at something like ADHD, what we understand is that there's this potential that there's a dopamine deficiency. And because there's a dopamine deficiency, individuals who experience ADHD are always searching for dopamine, which is why they have this hyperactivity. But I want to pose a slightly different thought, which is interesting. If we say that that dopamine would create a reward, then the idea is that we might be able to focus our attention, even if we have a slight overactivation of our default mode network, by getting into a place where we're placing a reward at the end of it to motivate us. But the problem is, if we get to that and it's not really the reward that we want because it wasn't mapped out, our default mode network isn't necessarily going to know that the task is over. So then it's just going to throw the next thing on top of us. Now, here's where mindfulness meditation becomes interesting and mindfulness in general. When they did a study, what they found with mindfulness is that they were able to create a reduction in the default mode network from a place where there was no reward. Now, this is what's interesting. If I create something where I say, okay, brain knows that this video or brain knows that doing this thing is going to give me dopamine, then I go towards that, right? And that's my default attention creating the objective to have my focused attention take an action. My focused attention takes that action. And then what happens? Well, after my focused attention takes that action, then the next thing that happens is I get the reward. But what happens if my default attention, what happens if that part of my brain that's connected to the default mode network doesn't know that that reward is what it ultimately wants? Well, then I create another reward and another reward and another reward. And before you know it, I get to this place where we go into this phenomena kind of called tunnel vision or rabbit holing, right? If you've ever been on that doom scrolling deep dive at 2 a.m. where you go into this rabbit hole on conspiracy theories or, what's the best way to like cook turkey for Thanksgiving, even though it's the middle of the summer. But I mean, it'd be a good thing to know, could prep ahead of time, could even go on Amazon and buy all the things that I need, right? And you come out of this spiral and you go, wow, that doesn't even why did I even do that? Well, because when you don't give your default attention something to really focus on, then it starts taking over because it doesn't know when the task is done, and it'll just start throwing you down this rabbit hole. And this is where we understand the difference between something like hyperfocus and flow state in its positive and negative correlations. So we would say hyperfocus is a really good thing until we start to look at if that hyperfocus is created by the default mode network, then what's happening is that we are getting caught in this thought spiral and we're just allowing that direction to happen haphazardly with whatever catches our attention. So then you look at advertising and all these other things and you start to say, well, yeah, that's kind of what they're doing, right? They're overloading you to the point where you don't know what direction it is that you need to move in. You're on your phone way longer than you should be. You're starting to deplete what's called all your SRUs, which we'll go into in a different video, but basically it's where your willpower comes from. You're depleting all of your willpower, and then before you know it, you're compulsively buying things that you don't really need because it's the only thing that will get you out of that spiral and give you a sense of completion in that default attention. So I want to give you a different kind of thought. I want to give you a thought of what's called flow state. From the meditation perspective, we could call this a non-doing, if you've ever heard that before. So there's doing and there's non-doing in a lot of different meditation books and practices and whatnot. Even in the Buddhist idea or the Taoist idea, there was this non-doing state. It's a non-dual state. What we're talking about here neurologically is the idea of flow, which is efficiency. There's no effort to anything because the effort, based off of the neuroscience, is showing us that effort, quite literally, is just the desynchronization of your default attention or your resting state and your focused attention or your conscious action state. So how do we sync those guys up? Well, one of the ways, believe it or not, is actually through visualization and setting intentions. Now, here's where we kick this into spirituality and make it make sense that science is truthfully spirituality and spirituality is truthfully science. What happens here is that we need to visualize the pathway to understanding how to complete that task. So let's say, for instance, you are going to the grocery store. We'll use that example again, right? Yes, you write out your list, but beyond that, you visualize yourself getting those groceries. And you go through that process and you go through the feeling states of how good it's going to feel to get to the end of that. And you know what that does? That actually primes your default attention to have an entire set list that it can run in the background and just hand your focused attention part of your brain each and every one of those tasks so that it can complete it. And before you know it, you get into something called flow, where your default attention has taken a back seat. Your focused attention is there, which means you're presently aware, but all of those different things that are kind of the unknowns, all those equations are being run in the background by your default attention because it always wants to have things to do, right? And your focused attention just wants to be on the one thing that it's doing. So when those two are working properly together, it's a match made in heaven because it creates this understanding of what we call a flow state. And that flow state is quite literally your ability to just have your default attention take a back seat, work in the background, and have your focused attention come forward so that you can get moving from task to task to task. And when you complete those tasks, there's this feeling of satisfaction because you're actually present for the completion of the tasks. Much like the idea of when you're eating a meal in front of a TV and you don't even know that you're eating, when you're doing all of these tasks, but you have no idea of where the end goal is supposed to be because you haven't visualized it and you haven't set an intention for what you want the outcome to be, it's always going to lead to overactivity of that default mode network, a derailing, a tunnel vision, a rabbit hole. And before you know it, you're going to be in an entirely different place than where you want to be consciously. So here's what's cool. If we look at this and we take it into the idea of mindfulness, then we start to understand that when they did this research project with meditators, what they realized was that meditators naturally had a more reduced rate for their default mode network. So here's the thing. When it comes to all of this, we have to understand that meditation does something that just cognitive processing can't. And we're not entirely sure why that is quite yet. It's still a little bit unknown. So when we look at the idea of how to shut off the default mode network, one of the ways is by cognitive tasks. You don't want to have all those thoughts? Get to a place where you have a math test that's got 10 questions and you've got 5 minutes to complete it. I promise you, if you're going through those questions, really and truly, you're not going to have a whole lot of energy to try to get into these overthinking spirals, right? It's the same idea when it comes to laborers. So let's say, for instance, you're working in the coal mines or you're a construction worker. You start to get to this place where your body is going through these movements so methodically, so rhythmically, so connected, that your mind starts to shut off and it just becomes this meditation in and of itself, in the truest sense of the word meditation, right? Now, that being said, when they looked at these meditators in this research project, what they found was that these individuals didn't necessarily have like a crazy leg up on the cognitive tasks side of things, meaning when they took a control group who had not been meditating, and when they took these meditators who had been long-term meditators, what they found by basically having them go into these cognitive tasks that was different was not the idea that the default mode network would shut off. It wasn't that it was never running. What was different about it was the level of intensity in which it shut off during those cognitive tasks for people who had meditated versus people who had not meditated. Now, here's why this is important. If you start to look at the idea of mindfulness practices as focused attention, then what we start to understand about it is that if we are constantly in a place of overactivity of that default mode network, it's going to be really hard for us to focus our attention, because all of the research is showing when you are in a position where your default mode network is overactivated, your focused attention wanes. And even when it comes to problem solving, you're worse at problem solving because you cannot get the energy to your focused attention to be there in the present moment. So it derails the whole situation. Through mindfulness, mindfulness is quite literally a focused attention practice. Where are you right now? Can you feel yourself in your chair? Can you feel the headphones in your ears? Can you feel your breathing? That, my friends, is focused attention. Now, if we can continually do that, what we're doing is something similar, not exactly the same, but similar to what's happening in these meditative states. And what that is that we are starting to gain control of the mind, putting our attention where we want it to be, and setting these processes up to work efficiently together instead of against each other. So in these meditators, they found that in general, they had less activity in their default mode network overall, but the really big change was when they had to focus their attention, their default mode network complied really, really easily. Whereas in the control group, it wasn't nearly as significant of a reduction in the activity of the default mode network. So what that means is that just through the meditation and mindfulness practices, all of that introspective thought, all of that self-referential thought, all of the aspects of this rumination, overthinking, introspection, so on and so forth, that cause us these problems in life, just naturally starts to drop away because we're training our attention to focus on what we want to focus it on. And that's what all these people have been saying all along, guys. That's the thing we have to realize. This is no new information. It's just new to neuroscience. But again, the neuroscience proves that not only is this something that's been talked about subjectively for centuries in all of these different religious practices, now we're starting to see, hey, this is actually how the brain works, which is pretty cool if you ask me. All right, so now let's dive into this just a little bit further before we close up here for this episode. In the next episode, I'm going to give you a basically step-by-step process on how to become better at true meditation. We're talking about dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. So stay tuned for that. But I want to close this out by starting to look at what happens when we don't fix this overactivity of our default mode network. What happens when this kind of like wild horse part of our mind just continues to run rampantly wherever it wants. Now, all of these things are based off of studies that are still in some cases theoretical and hypothetical. I did do the research to get through all of these, and you can see all my citations down in the bottom of the description. But what I want you guys to think about is that if even a tiny iota of this is true, it may mean that the default mode network and the overactivity of it has a lot more to do with these mental health issues than we initially believed that it did. So when we look at the idea of Alzheimer's, for instance, a lot of the studies are finding that part of what's going on with Alzheimer's may actually be related to neurodegeneration in the default mode network. So that means degeneration of the neurology in the default mode network. Now, this becomes really interesting when we start to look at, well, I thought the whole idea is that we don't want to have activity in the default mode network. So if it just dies, then why would that be a bad thing? But you have to realize that a lot of your cognitive processing is actually happening through the default mode network. It's just that it's supposed to take a back seat to our focused attention when we need our focused attention. So the whole idea is that as we start to have that neurodegeneration happen in the default mode network, that may actually be linked to Alzheimer's. Now, ADHD is another really interesting one because what we find with ADHD is a few different principles. The one principle with ADHD is obviously that we have developmental neurological issues, meaning that we don't have proper neuromaturation. The brain doesn't develop properly. Now, there's many different reasons behaviorally and cognitively why that could be, and this is still a widely studied theory. However, a lot of the science is showing that it holds up pretty well across the board. So when we look at the idea of ADHD and say, okay, the brain didn't develop appropriately for some reason, one of the areas that has that lack of proper neuromaturation is actually the default mode network. So they did a study, and what they found was that with individuals who had ADHD compared to the control group, when they ended up doing fMRI scans, which are just functional MRI scans of their brains, when it came to the default mode network, they found that both of them had activity in the default mode network. That was normal, but the connections in the actual areas intrinsically of the default mode network in ADHD were slightly more disconnected than they were in the control group. The other thing that they found was that the reduction of the default mode network when people focused their attention was significantly less in people who had ADHD comparatively to the control group. So what is that saying? Well, what that's saying is if that default mode network doesn't have all of the connections wiring up properly for it, that may lead to things where we fall into a lot of daydreams. It may lead to things where we find ourselves disassociating more often. It may also lead to things where we have a harder time focusing and we start to get caught up in the idea of these just like distracting thoughts and thought spirals. Now, part of the curiosity with this when it comes to ADHD is how does this affect meditation? Well, think about it. If you sit down for meditation, right? And you find, for instance, that guided meditation or listening to music works really well for you because it's almost like it makes your brain shut off. What are we saying here, guys? Think about it. If ADHD is the idea of a lack of proper linking in the default mode network, as well as an overactivity that even with focused attention doesn't decrease as much as the control groups does, then what we're saying here is that when I start to do something that creates more focused attention, I start to have a decrease in that default mode network. Now, my curiosity is if you did that continually over time with something like a mindfulness practice, would you start to change how your brain is operating? If we understand that neuroplasticity can rewire some of that neuronal architecture, that brain architecture, then is it possible, and I don't know, it's just a thought, is it possible that as we start to take on a more serious mindfulness practice and we start to work with our brain, understanding that one of the biggest issues for people with ADHD is not procrastination, it's not object permanence. Maybe one of the biggest issues is the lack of proper synchronization and correspondence between the default attention and the focused attention. And if we start creating tasks that create more of that focused attention, we take away some of that urge of wanting to constantly task switch to get that dopamine. Do we start to build up a tolerance to that dopamine deficiency that then allows us to focus our mind more easily, and beyond that, allows us to start to not only rewire that default mode network, but also decrease its activity during our focus time? Something just to think about. Now, the other one that I want to talk about is depression as well as addiction, because this connects, the default mode network connects to those as well. So when we look at the idea of things like depression, drug addiction, and even honestly schizophrenia, they're finding that some of the research is showing that there's a connection between overactivity of the default mode network and schizophrenia, which does make sense when you start to think about that schizophrenia is usually accompanied by hallucinations and a lack of internal versus external perception, meaning that the outside world and the inside world are a little bit more vague as to which one is which. And so we start to have these sensory shifts that can create hallucinatory effects. Now, that being said, if that's connected there, and it's also connected to the idea of something like depression, where we find that an overactivity of the default mode network is one of the main reasons why rumination happens in depression. And rumination is basically where we get stuck on these thoughts. So ruminating could look like you're, for instance, at a party and you tell a joke and nobody laughs, and everybody else goes home and they don't really concern themselves too much with it after that. But for you, you end up sitting at home and you're awake for hours just thinking to yourself, my gosh, I said such a horrible joke. Why didn't they laugh? Maybe it wasn't a good joke. Maybe they don't like me. Guys, that's rumination. But what's interesting is that one of the main centers that gets overactive through rumination is the default mode network. And it's been shown that things like meditation and mindfulness practices can not only decrease the activity of the default mode network, but in turn, they also decrease rumination, which then can shift what's happening in terms of those depressive cycles. So it may be a way to be able to help people get out of those ruminations that create depressive spirals. And that's what the research has been showing in some of these studies. Now, the last one that I want to talk about is drug addiction, because if we take it to a little bit wider and broader of a perspective than just drug addiction with like methamphetamines and heroin and so on and so forth, if we take it to the idea of compulsory behaviors that are through drug cravings by needing to get a release, social media, attention seeking, overeating, undereating, looking at those as addictive principles, then what they find is that when the default mode network has a hyperactivity in individuals who have addiction types of behaviors, it creates and is linked to the drug cravings that they get. And the idea is that once they end up taking those drugs, it suppresses the activity of the default mode network and the drug craving goes away for a period of time. So this is interesting because think about it, right? When we're looking at the idea of meditation, one of the big parts of meditation is simply just being. But again, if we're used to that overactivity of that default mode network that causes introspection and everything else, that's going to feel really boring because it's just going to be our focused attention on something like, our breath, right? Our focused attention on a mantra, any of these different things. Again, this whole idea is basically saying that non-doing state is what we're seeking, because through non-doing, we create flow, which is the proper coherence or the proper synchronization between our default attention and our focused attention, so that our default attention can run in the background and our focused attention can be something that keeps in the foreground where it's supposed to be, that puts us naturally in the present moment. Because who doesn't want to be more in the present moment? Am I right? I know I do. So the last thing that I want to leave you with before we go on to the next episode, which in the next episode, I'll leave you with a lot more to be able to really tangibly not only hold on to this, but have a practical application and understanding of how you can use this in your everyday life to create more of these focused attention states and also reach higher states of conscious awareness, which is the goal of meditation when it comes to dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. So before that, what I want to leave you with is just the idea of what we can do to start to really shift what's happening in this default mode network. So again, the first step when it comes to any type of task orientation is set your intention. And I don't just simply mean say, I'm going to get it done. Set your intention for what you want that outcome to be based off of a feeling state, based off of how you want to feel at the end, and visualize yourself feeling that way before you even start the task. The reason why is because what this is doing is this is loading your default mode network with all of the information that it can then keep running and compiling in the background as your focused attention kicks in. And I promise you, if you can do that, it's going to be a heck of a lot easier to tackle even the most difficult tasks for you. The second thing is we need to build up our focused attention. And what that means when I say we need to build up our focused attention is we need to start looking at how we can concentrate on things for a more prolonged period of time. So I want you to think about the idea of something like a monastic life, right? Where everything is done mindfully. You're cooking for hundreds, maybe thousands of people on a daily basis, if that's your task for that period of time in the monastic side of things. You're doing prayer, you're doing meditation, you're reading scripture and other types of scholarly work. All of this requires a massive amount of focused attention. Now, again, there's less distractions, right? There's not necessarily social media or the internet or all these other things, or at least for a while there wasn't. I have a feeling that probably a fair amount of the monastic schools now have Wi-Fi. I'm sure they're probably living in the 21st century. And I'm sure that there's some that don't. But what I'm saying here, beyond that, is the recognition that we need to start to be able to control what's happening in our mind and with our attention. So say, for instance, you need to write an email to someone, but you also need to send a text message to someone, and you want to make sure that on social media you're not missing anything for your business or just checking up with people and, oh yeah, that's right, there was that person who wanted to schedule something with you. Now what you're telling your default mode network here is, hey, I got a bunch of crap and I don't know how to sort it out, so have fun. How do you think your default mode network's going to feel? It's going to be like, what do you want me to do with this? You haven't given me any pathway. You haven't given me any understanding of how I'm supposed to compile this together to know when I'm done with it. That's the key, guys, to know when I'm done with it. So instead, pick one task and take whatever amount of time it is, whether it's 1 minute or 1 hour, and focus solely on that task with zero distractions. And what I'm talking about when I say zero distractions is not just the idea of your phone or the internet or the email or anything else. I'm talking about the internal distractions. This is where we start to create better focus. And as we create better focused attention, what we do is we build up a tolerance to that want to switch tasks. If you find yourself falling into rabbit holes all the time, the reason why is because you've gotten very conditioned to being lax about holding your attention on any singular thing. And so that means whatever piques your interest in that moment, you're just going to dive down that hole. That is tunnel vision, where we can't really see what's going on. Imagine, for instance, driving a car and you're only seeing out of pinholes. Yeah, if there's nothing that comes around you, you might be fine. But what happens when a car tries to merge? What happens when you're on the highway and you can't see both the road and the sign that you're trying to use to get off the exit? This is what tunnel vision does. It gets us really, really specifically focused in one teeny tiny little line, and there's no ability for recorrection to create better efficiency. Instead, when we focus on a singular task in the present moment, and I say, okay, I got to write this email. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to take 10 minutes to write this email uninterrupted. Then I end up going to write the email, but before that, I visualize, okay, what is the outcome that I'm looking for? I feel myself writing the email and feeling really good about it. I feel myself sending it and getting the outcome that I'm looking for. I feel that feeling in my body. I visualize it happening, so it's almost as if it's already happening. That gives my default attention everything that it needs to run with. And then I go into the task. And if I don't have the trained focused attention, then what happens is partway through the task, these thoughts start coming up. And as these thoughts start coming up, I start going, oh, should I this? Should I that? Should I? And it's almost like my attention's being pulled in different directions. That's the default mode network trying to take over, which again, if that's how it normally happens in life, then of course, that's what we're going to be used to. So as we start to develop this further and further, then we finally get to a place where we're able to start to keep that focused attention for that whole 10 minutes of that email. And once we're done with that email, then we can move on to the next task. And this creates the task efficiency that, again, doing multiple tasks at once is never going to create. We have to have a roadmap in our mind of how this is going to happen. And the first thing that we need to do is learn how to focus our attention. So take those times throughout your day, throughout your week, throughout the next month if you can, and find those times when you can practice this. Maybe, for instance, it's something as simple as brushing your teeth in the morning, something that most people do totally unconsciously as they're thinking about all kinds of other thoughts. What would happen if you took your toothbrush and brushed with the opposite hand than you were used to, which would require you to have focused attention, and it might honestly upset you a little bit. Why? Because it's not as easy. because you can't go on autopilot, because you have to be present. But through doing that and through being able to be present, what you'll learn is that you can focus your attention for a lot longer than you think you can. And again, as you do that more and more and more, you start to put the default mode network where it's really supposed to be, running in the background most of the time when we're awake. So the other thing that we want to look at is how we can bring that mindfulness into everyday activities and experiences. And in the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys a step-by-step process of how you can start to get to a place of reaching these deeper states of meditation through being able to focus your attention and take each one of the precautionary and preparatory steps that you need to be able to get there. Because again, it's not as simple as just throwing on one of these apps and listening to a 5-minute thing and hoping that if you do that for 10 years, you're going to reach enlightenment. I promise you, you won't. That's not the purpose of it. It's nervous system regulation. And we'll go into that in the next video. So again, I hope this helped you to better understand the neuroscience behind meditation. Remember to stay curious, and I'll see you next time.